So our next and last speaker is Mick Roderick, who is our BirdLife Woodland Bird Program Manager. The Woodland Birds Program aims to enhance the conservation of all threatened and declining woodland species, some of which you've just talked about in the Cowra area. And BirdLife does this through either single species recovery work, such as swift parrot, Regent Honeyeater and red-tailed black cockatoos, or multi-species projects like Birds on Farms. Mick is probably most known to a lot of us from his Regent Honeyeater captive release updates. This program forms part of the National Regent Honeyeater Recovery Plan implementation. And I hope you realise I've got my Regent Honeyeater earrings on that are terribly subtle, but serve their purpose. Mick today will focus on what's happened in the past couple of years and on recovery work that BirdLife Australia manages. So welcome, Mick, and thank you so much.
Thanks so much, Judy. Can somebody just confirm that they can see that screen?
Yes.
Oh, great. Okay, so yeah, I'm now the Woodland Bird Program Manager at BirdLife. Going to talk about Regents, and I will give a little bit, I'm going to focus on things that have happened in the last couple of years, because I'm sure most of you are pretty familiar with what's been happening with this poor old bird. But I will give it a bit of background to the recovery efforts as well, and then I'll sort of focus on the captive release updates towards the end. So I guess this is a really good segue to Sue's talk about Cowra, because people are probably familiar with shorebirds and seabirds being a whole guild of birds that are across the border declining, but woodland birds are also very much one of those. And I think it's testament when you have something like hooded robin jumping over vulnerable and going straight to endangered nationally. It's a real worry. And apart from diamond firetail and brown truecap, I also put in the chat that the southern whiteface has also been added to the EPBCA. So this is a guild of birds that are threatened as a group. And when you look at that map, it's no surprise why. That red shading there is pretty much the western slopes in New South Wales. They were once woodlands and they are no longer woodlands. So we've lost about 85% of our temperate woodlands, and of that 15% that remains, a lot of it is highly fragmented and doesn't serve as habitat for woodland birds. So this is what we're talking about when we talk about a nice looking temperate woodland. When you look at aerial photos or you look out the plane if you're coming into Sydney Airport, yep, there's a lot of bush out there. But the point is that a lot of that bush is in areas that was no good to be cleared. So basically along the spur of the Great Divide or coastal areas that were no good for agriculture. It's those woodlands on fertile soils that have mostly been lost, and that's where we've had the heaviest declines in birds that rely on that sort of habitat. So the most threatened of this guild of birds are the swift parrot and Regent Honeyeater. Swifties, we think, are down to around about 750 individuals. Regents, the most recent population estimate was around 250 to 350. That potentially could even be optimistic. There could easily be less than 200 regents left. So there's been a recovery team in place since the early 90s, and the most recent iteration of the recovery plan was in 2016. So when we look at this graph here, a lot of people might remember when David Gearing was the recovery coordinator, we started doing surveys and searches for regents and swifties. And they used to happen on actual weekends because, you know, it's almost a ludicrous thought that we did that on dedicated weekends just so we weren't getting double counts. To actually think that we could possibly get double counts of regents these days, yeah, it's quite sad that you're lucky to find any. But you can see there in the mid-90s, there were 1,500 birds actually counted. And the crimson bar on the graph there shows the number of sites the birds were reported from. So we're literally talking an entire, the entire population is probably the number of sites that birds were being reported from just 25 years ago. Why have regents declined so much when other birds have lost similar habitat? We don't exactly know, but I think it's something to do with their lifestyle choice. Regents are very mobile. They're quite fussy. They're like koalas. They have their favourite trees to feed on the nectar of. And when you move around the landscape, looking for those rich patches, then you're running the risk of yeah, not. I mean, when a lot of your habitat has been lost, you're going back to places and finding no habitat, or the patches are full of noisy miners or whatnot. So in the last 20 years, the main breeding sites were condensed into these, sort of northern New South Wales. The Kapiti Valley, of course, was always the stronghold for the bird. The upper and lower Hunter Valleys, the Burragrang and northeast Victoria. But in the last 5 years, because the Kapiti hasn't really had a good year since 2017, but the vast majority of breeding has happened in the upper and lower Hunter Valley in the last few years. But we're now in a situation where the main threat to the Regent Honeyeater literally is its incredibly low numbers. This is a bird whose modus operandi was to occur in large flocks. It would arrive at a blossom site in numbers, throw its weight around, chase all the other birds away and breed. But with so few birds left, that strategy just doesn't work. And they're finding competition with large honeyeaters. And of course, when you've got so few birds nesting, they're just sitting ducks for all manner of nest predators, including, you name it, brush-tailed possums, squirrel and sugar gliders, ravens, kookaburras, currawongs, butcherbirds. All of these birds will have a go at the Regent Honeyeater nest. And this is an example. At the first release at Tamalpin in 2021, the day before that photo was taken, we found a nest that had 2 chicks in it. We went back the next morning, looking up in the tree, trying to see what's going on with the nest. Couldn't find anything in the tree, and then we hear this commotion on the ground, and there on the ground was one of the chicks just flapping around. Poor dad's trying to feed it. So what we assume had happened is overnight that nest was predated. Chick 1 got taken, and here's chick 2 on the ground. There's the nest. So fortunately, that bird was recovered by Taronga, and it's a female, and she's doing well, and she's contributing now to the captive population, which I'll talk about soon. So 2021 was not a bad year. We had 137 birds reported, and you can see from those stats there that pretty much every region these days, or just about every region, is reported in New South Wales. A few birds are just hanging on in northeast Vic and in southeast Queensland. The vast majority of birds, even in New South Wales, are now reported from the periphery of the Blue Mountains, which includes the lower Hunter as well. We include that in what we refer to as the periphery of the Blue Mountains. Last year was a very poor year. In fact, it was our lowest ever count of birds, 62 birds from only 15 sites. And more than half of those birds were found in Melbourne. So if it wasn't for that one site, there would have been around 30 regions reported last year. And so far this year, we're up to about, actually this slide's outdated, we're up to, right now up to 7 wild birds this year, all found in or around Tamalpin. And recently we've had some regions turn up feeding in a Banksia-dominated habitat right next door to Tamalpin where they breed. So this is really amazing information. And we've only actually been able to get this information because we've been tracking our zoo-bred birds. I won't spend too much time on these very busy slides, except to point out that in 2021, 37 out of 41 nests were in the upper or lower Hunter. There were potentially 3 nests in the Kapiti, 2 were confirmed. And we did manage to get 3 fledglings out of the Kapiti Valley. And there was a nest up north at Gulf Creek that unfortunately failed. So, all these years, when this bird was declining, we always used to say to each other, it's all right, they're still breeding in the Kapiti. It's okay, the Kapiti's there. But the Kapiti really seemed to have got knocked around a bit by the drought. And there was a nest in Victoria, which involved a male bird from a release in 2017 who paired with a wild female. They built a nest in a box mistletoe on the 6th of October, and then within a few days that nest was destroyed by a big rain event. Then after our release in Tamalpin, we had a very exciting thing. That bird in the bottom left there is a released female. She paired with a wild male within 10 days of release. She built a nest, sat, but after 4 days of incubating, just abandoned the nest. And then we had a wild pair, basically did the same thing, built a nest, she sat, and after 2 days, the birds just didn't go back. And that was it. we had 3 nests across the entire range of this species last year, and none of them were successful. So we were staring down the barrel of last year being the first ever season without any evidence of breeding, until about a month ago, when again we were tracking our released birds, and they led us to this Banksia habitat, and lo and behold, here were these 2 very young birds. The bird on the left is about 4 months old. The bird on the right is about 8 months old. So we've got evidence of there having been 2 successful broods. So, yay, two birds added to the population that we know of. So banding still happens, but as you can imagine, there's been very few birds banded in the last few years. And so Ross came up and he banded those 2 young birds. There's one of them there, orange, blue, pink metal. Keep your actually, sorry, that should read white metal. Yeah, keep your eyes out for these birds. Prior to that, it wasn't, December 2021 was the last time that a wild bird was banded, and that was by Dean Ingleson in December. And interestingly, that bird, people might be familiar with the fact that Regent Honeyeaters can make calls of other honeyeaters. That wild bird there, I watched calling to a female zoo bird in a zoo call. So the zoo birds actually can make different sounds, different calls to the wild birds. That's actually being addressed now by researchers to try and make the zoo birds sound better. But I thought it was fascinating that this wild male was making zoo calls. And we had another wild bird that turned up at our release site, and we could work out, thanks to the fantastic camera Toto, Tim Pasila was able to get a great image that narrowed it down to a bunch of birds that were banded in the Capity in 2015. So we actually have fitted some satellite transmitters to 3 zoo birds. We are able to fit a satellite transmitter to a wild bird, but we haven't caught one that's been heavy enough. But in any case, these 3 birds that carry these satellite transmitters, and you have to remember that this is absolute cutting edge technology. People like Matt have used this sort of technology on much larger birds like bitterns, and of course it's happened with shorebirds and seabirds. But this is the first time, to our knowledge, that it's ever been attempted on a passerine or a bush bird. Unfortunately, it just didn't work, and we think it's perhaps because, unlike bitterns and maybe shorebirds, that these guys are under a canopy quite a bit, so maybe the batteries just weren't charging. The population viability analysis done by the ANU at the beginning of last year concluded that we need to protect habitat, we need to get nests more productive, we need more chicks getting out of the nests, and we need to maintain these releases. So when we find nesting birds, where we can, we put up trunk guards to try and keep mammals away. Last year we only found 3 nests, and we're only able to get a collar on 1. We don't know what caused the failures. The problem really is actually finding the nest. With a bird with a range from basically Melbourne to Brisbane, and these birds move around. They don't go back to the same places to breed very often. So Steve mentioned noisy miners being a problem, and that's something that BirdLife Australia and ANU are both licensed to deal with, but only at Regent Honeyeater breeding sites. So we've done a lot of work removing noisy miners from Regent Honeyeater breeding sites with some success, depending on the nature of the landscape. And Ross Crates has just recently published something with that research. And of course, the Capity tree planting has been happening for the last 30 years, and we're pushing 300 hectares and 150,000 seedlings having been planted. The next planting is coming up in the first weekend of May, and we've even seen some regions using some of these plantings. So I'm just going to quickly talk about mistletoe being very important. In fact, it's in a way seen regions through this recent bottleneck because a lot of the recent nests have been in or near mistletoe. You can see on that aerial photo, this is Tamalpin, where a really bad fire went through a few years ago. Unlike other plants, when mistletoe is burnt, it's dead. So we essentially lost just about every mistletoe clump in that forest, which is what the regents feed and breed in. So we thought, you know, if we're able to put in stems in the ground as a form of habitat restoration, why not just put stems up into the canopy? So we pick fruit in the mistletoe clumps where they're low to the ground, and then on that that left image, I don't know if you can see my mouse, you can see an arborist at the top of the tree. There's no point planting these mistletoe fruits low down. Regents won't use those clumps they need to be up in the canopy. And it's really easy work. It's great. I do it with my kids. You know, we walk around and we pick mistletoe fruits, and you just wipe them onto a branch, and potentially that could then form a mistletoe clump. It's just so sticky. And so far we've planted 3,500 seeds back into this very badly burnt forest. That was a canopy fire. So in a way, we're putting the mistletoe bird out of a job. We're doing his work for him, because otherwise we'd have to wait for mistletoe birds to deposit seeds back into this forest. And Regent Honeyeaters just don't have that time. We've also been trialling this in the Capertee Valley, not because of fire, but because of drought. There was a very large die-off of the noodle-leaf mistletoe along the Capertee River, and so we've been out planting some seeds for mistletoe out there. And it's really cottoned on, this mistletoe thing. And there was an article published in the Guardian a couple of years ago, and I reckon that's fantastic that Leo shared our article, and Leo's got 17 million followers, so I reckon that's pretty cool. All right, so I'm not sure how long I've got left, but I'm just going to give an update on the captive releases. So there are two reasons that we breed regents in captivity. One is just to make sure that they don't disappear from Earth altogether, and the other is to actually supplement the wild population with zoo-bred birds. So things are pretty serious with this bird that we're having to do that. The most recent, so most of the releases have happened in Victoria, but the most recent releases have happened in the Carnarvon woodlands. And that's just a map there showing Regent Honeyeater records overlaid on that red outline, which is the Hunter Economic Zone, which is a big conservation battle that we're fighting. We got to one-up with the Warragamba, hopefully, if that's a permanent thing. So this is where the last two releases have happened, and it's really handy having this mountain just on the other side of where we do the releases, because you're able to get signals from the radio transmitters that we're tracking the birds with.
Need to be pretty quick, Mick, please.
Yeah, okay, all right.
No.
So we had successful breeding in 2021. We had a stimulation between zoo birds and wild birds. We had up to 40 birds, mixed flocks of zoo and wild birds. And these birds actually persisted right through till August last year. And we got some really good media. We even had a piece aired on the project, which you can Google on YouTube. Then we did another release last year in the same place. And I've already mentioned we had our first ever pairing of a captive female with a wild male in New South Wales. And we had other pairings happening, but we didn't have any successful nesting. The release didn't happen until the end of November, so potentially it was just a bit late. We didn't release until then because the ironbarks hadn't started flowering till then. We had to delay the release. Battery started dying in early January. We were able to fit 3 more birds with transmitters. One of those birds, orange-white there in the photo, he led us to this Banksia-dominated habitat, where we've now had 9 regents found in a habitat that had never, ever had regents recorded in it. So this is really brand new information that we're learning. We're learning about what some of these wild birds are doing by following our zoo birds. It's really amazing stuff. And the mortality in these recent 2 releases has been the lowest ever. So I think it's an incredible place to be focusing our efforts for our captive releases, because birds are surviving and breeding. And just lastly, a quick mention for worm, white, orange, red metal. This is a bird that was released in a Chiltern release down in Victoria in 2015. He was just over 5 months at release, and he was seen at the end of last year. He's more than 8 years old and he's still kicking. So we do know that these birds survive. I'll give a quick plug to, Matt mentioned some kids' books for Bittens. There's now one out there for Regents, The Forgotten Song, published by CSIRO. So thanks, guys. There's a quick snapshot. sorry for rushing, but there's a lot to tell with Regents.